do we expect to see an updated version of the body composition exemption?
Yeah, 100%. Right now, the current exemption is still valid through the end of the year because the current ACFT is still valid, through the end of the year, and so that's still a go. We're working a rapid revision right now to continue that based off the new standards.
Team, welcome back to another week of Mops and Mo's here with Drew and Alex. Before we get into conversations about who we're having conversations with today, I do want to get ahead of all the stuff that's come out recently about athletic trainers, about civilian cuts, about Army fitness tests, which is what we'll talk about today. But just a quick maybe plug for Mops and Mo's, but we will be putting out content about both Alex and I's opinions on these things, about some of the news that's come out, the announcements. So look for that in the forms of reels, full-length podcasts, potentially future discussions. I know with the athletic trainers specifically, this is something potentially happening several months from now. And one thing that I know you and I have talked about trying to do with that is to keep it at the fore for as long as we can versus just putting everything out all at once and then people forget about it. So I know today's episode is about the Army fitness test, specifically a little bit about H2F, but I just wanted to put that out there for folks listening, wondering if Drew and Alex are going to have something to say about what's going on. We absolutely will. So stand by. But anyway, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, so Drew already mentioned it, but today's episode is going to be specifically about the Army fitness test. If you have not been following any of the Army uproar, it is no longer the Army combat fitness test. Over the next few months, we'll be transitioning to the Army fitness test. We'll dig into the details of that change here in the main body of the episode, but our guest to chat about it is Command Sergeant Major Raymond Harris, who assumed responsibility as the Command Sergeant Major for the Army's Training and Doctrine Command in September of 2023. He initially enlisted all the way back in March 1996 as an infantryman. He attended one station unit training at Fort Benning, Georgia, and has served as a rifleman, machine gunner, automatic rifleman, Bradley gunner, team leader, squad leader, platoon sergeant, first sergeant, and command sergeant major. His full bio breaks out every assignment and medal, but I'll just hit a few of the highlights. He has served in infantry battalions across Fort Riley, Vilseck, Germany, Fort Cavazos, Fort Benning, Hawaii, Fort Campbell. He was a member of the Old Guard, but his brigade and higher level assignments have been with 165th Infantry Brigade at Fort Jackson. That's basic training. 3rd Security Force Assistance Brigade, 1st Infantry Division, and 5th Corps. His deployments include the Kosovo campaign, Operations Enduring Freedom, Cuba and Afghanistan, Operation Iraqi Freedom, and Operation EADR. If you, like me, don't know what that is, I had to look it up. It's European Assure, Deter, and Reinforce in support of Ukraine. Sergeant Major Harris is a graduate of all levels of the NCO education system and graduated in the Sergeant's Major Academy Class 64. His awards and decorations include the Legion of Merit with 3 Oak Leaf clusters, Bronze Star Medal with 1 Oak Leaf cluster, Meritorious Service Medal, and all of the campaign medals and chest candy badges you would expect based on his assignments and deployments.
I will say, first and foremost, obviously, both you and I are very thankful for the fact that this was somebody who was willing and able to come on and talk about this. The change to the PT test is, I guess it's safe to say it's huge news, at least in our little corner of the world. And oftentimes that just comes in the form of press releases, articles online, whatever. So here we are, we're able to have an actual conversation. Now, having said that, Sergeant Major is limited to what he can say and how deep he can go into some of these things. And as much as both Alex and I push him on some of that, we recognize that there is a line in the sand when somebody is speaking professionally on behalf of the Army. The last thing we want to do truly is get somebody in trouble. Not to mention, oftentimes we have their PA on the line with us. So if we do get them in trouble, we get in trouble. But nonetheless, I think it is a good conversation. I will say for folks, if you don't know, Alex and I do have a little bit of dialogue at the end of all of our interview episodes. And because today's episode is a little bit shorter than our traditional conversations, we go a little bit longer at the tail end when it comes to what you and I actually thought and some of our own takeaways. And so, stay tuned for kind of the professional discussion on the new Army fitness test and how that relates to some of the stuff happening in H2F. But then stick around till the end if you want to hear just Drew and Alex straight up riff on what we kind of think about the whole thing. And like I mentioned at the beginning of this intro, we will be putting out more on this. We recognize that there is a time and place to talk about back squats versus front squats. There's also a time and place to talk about, weird policy decisions despite return on investment metrics that are pretty positive. So I'll leave it there. I don't know if you have any closing thoughts before we press go.
That's it. I think we'll be returning to some of these topics in other conversations in the near future.
For sure. Enjoy.
This is not a standard episode for us. Usually we're like deep diving a specific issue. Sometimes it's with a researcher on the topic. Who knows? This is kind of a breaking news episode, which is pretty rare for us. But we are here because the Army just announced the planned transition from the ACFT, Army Combat Fitness Test, to just the Army Fitness Test, with the primary changes being the removal of the standing power throw and the establishment of sex-neutral but age-normed standards for specific combat MOSs. Before we dive into specific questions, I'd love to just turn it over to you, Sergeant Major Harris, let you tell us what's going on with this change. Like, what's the background? Why is this happening?
Yeah, thanks. And one, thanks for having me on and be able to really explain a little bit of this and really just promote, the Army Fitness Test because it is a change, but it's a change that we do quite often with everything that we do. Just because the landscape of warfare changes, our soldiers change, we got to make sure that our population is physically fit and ready to endure the rigors of combat. And so the one thing I do want to say about this is that this is about making sure we have warfighter lethality within our force. And so as you know, and most of the listeners know, last year's NDA directed us, to kind of look at the Army Combat Fitness Test, and more specifically, to look at our close combat forces. And the close combat forces are those that close in with and destroy the enemy of the United States of America. And so it's important to understand the close combat force and what they're designed to do, of why the 21 MOSs were picked to do that, because that fits within our close combat force. Along with the SecDef's directive of Army combat standards, the team went back and we looked to say, okay, where are we excelling, or where do we need to ensure that our close combat forces are meeting the rigors of combat and that they are ready to do exactly what I described earlier, to close in with, destroy the enemy, and do those kind of things. And so we're able to do that. And as you talked about earlier, the test was moved down to 5 events, and I know we'll get in probably some talking points about why that was moved into there, and probably the 21 military occupational specialties that were selected to do those things. But this change is also directly in line with the Chief of Staff of the Army's 4 focus areas too, as we look at warfighting, continuous transformation, delivering combat-ready forces, and strengthening the Army profession. And I think our Army Fitness Test fits right into all those things, because we are able to deliver our warfighters at the point of need at the physical assessments they need to be at. So the changes we made, I really think, are prudent to assess our warfighters and ensure that they're ready to do their mission and what they're called upon to do.
There's a couple directions we're going to go, and I think obviously the top 2 things here are the list of MOSs and what that means, and then we'll talk about the standing power throw in a second, I think, because that's very much something we're curious about. But I think to start, when the ACFT originally had MOS standards, black, gray, gold, moderate, significant, heavy, those were based on DAPAM 611-21 physical demand categories. And that list was different. 12 mics, your firefighters were in there. The rest of the field artillery, career field was in there. 88 mics, hotels, and kilos were in there. I'm curious how this particular list of 21 was developed. And then I'll ask about some specific MOSs after you answer that one.
Sure. Well, I mean, so that's exactly it, right? The Army Fitness Test is the Army's fitness test. The high physical demand tests are still be out there to assess, different CMFs or MOSs against the rigors of whatever specialty they're doing. A Cannoneer 13 Bravo has something a little bit different, because they now have to, pick up a round and load it with, charge it and all those other different things. But that's not necessarily IMTing and 3 to 5 second rushing towards an enemy to go assault a bunker and do those other things. So some of the physical demands are a little bit different in what they do. So those high physical demands are still out there to do. But now what we've done, with the AFT is really remove the combat focus on that and say, this is the Army fitness test standard for everybody with a heightened band for our close combat forces that we talked about with those 21 CMFs or 21 MOSs. And so those 21 MOSs are what's really in line with the NDA and the verbiage and the language that we got, which probably excluded some that we thought or some may think should be in there. And I know, like as you talked about, I know we'll talk about those, right? Because those MOSs didn't really fit into the spirit of the NDA language and what we were kind of looking at as in close in with and destroy. Remember, again, this is me running into a bunker to go destroy the enemy, not sitting at a flot or sitting in a safe zone, providing indirect fires to affect the battlefield, if that makes sense.
You've essentially already answered the question here. I'm mostly asking it because people on social media will come after me if I don't. Lots of people have expressed interest in a bunch of MOSs. So this is not an exclusive list of like MOSs that feel left out or anything like that.
MOS advocacy group.
Because like I've heard aviation, I've heard civil affairs, I've heard all sorts of MOSs. Air defense has a few MOSs that they feel like should belong in there. But I think the top three that come to mind for me when I look at this list, saying like, I wonder why those aren't on there. You already mentioned 13 Bravo, cannon crew member, 68 Whiskey, combat medic, and then our EOD folks, our 89 series. I'm curious about those three specifically. And yes, you've kind of already answered it, but this is me doing my due diligence.
No, well, thanks. And I won't belabor the answer on it either. But again, it's about those MOSs inherently part of their mission description is not to go rush into enemy fire. And so, again, the spirit of a close combat force to close in with and destroy maybe doesn't fit those MOSs in their main principle of what they're supposed to do by their job that well into what the spirit of close combat forces is, as we talk about. We can all recognize, especially at the 68 Whiskeys, they are there with an infantry squad or pick that echelon that's closing with and destroying, but probably aren't the first line of wave to go into a firefight or into a bunker or into a trench to go clear the enemy from that position. And so, again, the spirit of what we talked about for close combat forces really relies in the 21 MOSs, which is really, I think we're talking, really 5 CMFs, so certain 11s, certain 12s, certain 13s, almost every 18 series to include the 180 Alphas and the majority of our 19s, armor crew members and scouts. So,
do you see, and this is a bit of a hypothetical question, but like now that we've effectively bifurcated somewhat, do you see a world where as combat evolves, certain MOSs now rise to the top and get included into this higher standard, or is this kind of fixed for now?
Yeah, I think it's something we'll assess in a couple of years. Generally anything that we do, especially when it comes to fitness, whether it was the ACFT, the old APFT, everything else, we've always assessed the standards, every 3 to 5 years to say, is the scoring scale, should that be the same? Now with this new addition of close combat forces, I would assume that, in the next 3 to 5 years, we'll say, do more need to come into it, or do we need to continue to raise everybody's scores? Because just like anything, when you give a standard, it'll take a little while to get there, but everybody's going to meet the standard. And then that standard becomes the baseline. And so do you need to set maybe a new standard in 3 years? Because, again, the landscape of warfare has changed. The operational environment has changed. We need a little bit more from our close combat forces. So I would say probably in about 3 to 5 years, it'll be assessed again to say, what do we need to do? But we have to give it time before we make a substantive change again.
Sure.
So this is not where I was planning to go, but you've set me up for something I think about all the time. You mentioned it takes some time for the force to adapt to a new standard. The ACFT went through several iterations, right? 1.0, 2.0, 3.0. And it seemed like the force struggled to adapt to a higher standard with ACFT 1.0. And it also seems like we didn't really give them the chance to prove that they could. I think some of those standards, it was designed specifically because we saw the type of fitness designed by the APFT not serve us terribly well in certain global war on terror scenarios, right? We needed more strength. We needed more work capacity, something more functional than just push-ups, sit-ups, and running. But when the standards came out, they looked a little bit intimidating, and they got adjusted mostly downward pretty quickly. I'm curious, is Army leadership better braced for some of that initial struggle and helping push people to these higher standards this time around?
Yeah, absolutely. The ACFT was a drastic change from the APFT. It's not like, we kept the same three things and just created higher standards to do. We added 3 more events and really dynamically changed every event minus the 2-mile run, right?
Mm-hmm.
So 5 realistically brand new events that everybody really had to kind of work towards. Now, those that are always into functional fitness or, did sports and those obviously excelled. I think I know what we're going to see with the AFT, it's not that drastic because it's still the same events, actually, reducing by event. So, now down to 5, but they're already used to doing these events and they've been doing it for years now. So even the ACFT, we really gave everybody about 2 years to kind of get to the standard. That's a long time to get to a standard, right? And everybody rose to the occasion. And so I think, the same thing will happen with the AFT. I don't think we're going to see, the changes are going to be there, but I don't think it's going to be so drastic that it's not feasible or achievable, right? That's what we got to be able to support. Is it feasible? Is it achievable by all of our close combat forces while being, sex neutral, to be able to do that, to make the requirements? And I think I know we're there. I know that when we give all of our close combat forces the requirements, they're going to make it. I think that's just the mentality of them anyway, is to not fail, to say, okay, here's my new standard. I got to go meet this new standard. Let's move out and do it. And that's why we have great leadership in the Army. Our NCOs, officers, and warrant officers are going to make sure they get to that standard, because that's our duty and responsibility.
This one's a little bit of a personal question, slightly. Other people have been asking it. I'm not alone here, but I'm in the Army Reserve. I'm a military intelligence officer. When I was on active duty, all of my jobs were in infantry units. And I think a lot of people have experience with non-combat arms or non-close combat jobs that carry added physical demands when they are in assignments with maneuver units. I think specifically of some of my intel soldiers, 35 Mikes, 35 Papas, who, if they had been assigned to strategic intelligence units, would not have had a high physical demand. But when I have to embed them with an infantry platoon or company, now they're doing standard infantry tasks plus some of the intel tasks. I'm curious if there's been any discussion of how these standards affect like low density non-combat MOSs when they are assigned specifically to maneuver units.
Yeah, and thanks. And it's not about the unit; it's about the MOS. So to your point, is those other MOSs that are not considered in that close combat force, a part of the 21, they still will just meet the Army standard, right? Minimum 60% in each event with an aggregate of 300, and that's their standard to meet, because that's the MOS that they serve in, not the unit that they're in. And so that is what'll do that. Now, we all know that when you serve in those units, you're just inherently going to, you yourself as a person, as a soldier, are going to meet those standards because you want to stay with the squad, you want to stay with the platoon, and that's what leadership's going to help you do. But they're not going to be held to that close combat force standard.
Okay, the question everybody wants to hear the answer to: why the standing power throw? Why did we take it away? Surely you would have known that at Mops and Mo's we published stickers with the power throw. Those are out of style now. So I wanted to ask, why specifically the standing power throw?
So standing power throw, when we actually went back and looked at it, it was about technique. It wasn't about power. It wasn't about strength. And so our soldiers were training more to technique of how to throw the ball than actually developing the strength and the power what they need to be able to do those things. We also found that there was a higher case, you had a better potential to injure yourself in that because of the technique and not necessarily developing the right muscle groups to move that ball where you need to get to the distance. And so it really didn't bear on our overall assessment of your physicality, for anybody, right? For all MOSs, regardless of what it is. And so that's the reason we took it out. Technique, not measurable, right? Mm-hmm. Because all you got to do is practice it. You can do it and you pass it every time. I've never failed the ball throw, but I had really good technique and I'm pretty strong. So it was easy, but it was all technique. I would tell you, my son, he's an ROTC cadet right now, going through and the ball throw, it destroys him every time, but his technique is not good. And I, but then again, I found myself trying to show him the right technique when he comes home from college, to do that. And it really resonated with me. So when we really went through that, and determine, hey, this is more technique based than strength based. Why do we measure it? Is it needed, not needed? And that's ultimately, where the decision came from to remove it.
I'm going to underline what the Sergeant Major said there because I think it's an important concept for people listening to this from a strength and conditioning perspective. If you're a coach who's listening and a soldier comes to you and asks how to improve on really any of the other events, you start talking to them about that component of fitness, not the specific movement. How do you develop lower body strength? How do you develop anaerobic capacity? How do you develop aerobic capacity? And that's true to a degree on the standing power throw. But the problem is if you're being honest about how they could best improve their standing power throw, the answer is just doing the standing power throw over and over again. And this, we've talked about Goodhart's Law on this podcast over and over again. When the measure becomes the goal, it stops being a good measure, meaning that we weren't trying to assess the standing power. Nobody thinks you're going to chuck something backwards over your head in combat. That skill is kind of irrelevant. It's that it's supposed to measure a component of fitness. And I have a post coming out in a day. By the time this episode is out, I'll have already posted it, but I looked through some of the research and it confirms what the Sergeant Major just said. It has been tested in research. If you want to go on PubMed and look it up, it's usually called the backwards overhead medicine ball throw, bomb throw. We kind of missed out on a cool name there.
Yeah, I forgot about that.
But what you consistently find in that research is there's one article from 2001 that says this is a pretty good, valid, and reliable assessment of power. And every time they've researched it since then, they've kind of chipped away at that, finding issues with the correlations, finding the learning effect. So it's all about technique, finding that it might be strongly influenced by body mass, just a bunch of other factors. It doesn't correlate as well as we'd like with vertical jumps, with cleans, with other assessments of power. I don't know. There are people out there who really like it because athleticism is important for soldiers. But I think the scholarly literature out there justifies this decision in terms of it might not have been the best. And then I think Drew and I will riff on this in future episodes, but power is like 70 or 80% just strength. And at the strength level of most soldiers, you can get just as good results from classic strength training as you can from specialized power training. And if we have coaches in place, they can handle power training and it's good to go. You should still train for it. Don't forget about it. But I think they're not coming out of nowhere with this decision.
Thanks for that.
Next important question that the people want to know: scoring scales. We haven't seen them yet. Should the close combat MOSs expect to just move to the existing men's scale, or is it going to be a little different than that?
When this goes active in June, the scales are being finalized right now, so I don't want to get out and do those because I haven't seen them. But they will be there. And so when this goes active, everybody will know what the scoring scales are going to be. And again, they're all going to be achievable and feasible. It's all built off the data that we've seen from, over 10,000 ACFTs that have been done in the Army to kind of baseline normalize these scores a little bit to figure out what is the right metric to ensure that we are keeping our close combat forces at a higher standard, but again, is achievable. And again, that's the key, setting those achievable and feasible goals for our soldiers to be able to make.
So I don't know how involved you are in developing those scales, and you probably can't answer this question, and that's okay, but I still have to ask it. There's been a lot of chatter about ACFT run standards being a little bit soft potentially, and I know there's
a lot of
discussion
chatter
of like earlier events being fatiguing, but like we're aerobic capacity fanatics around here. I think it correlates really well with injury risk. It correlates really well with job performance, all these things. Is there a possibility that when we see these scales come out, the run standards will be slightly stricter than the current standards?
Yeah, I don't know. And I don't mean that to be nebulous or anything else like that, but that part I'm not involved in right now because they're still working that under, with the guidance of the data and the folks that are working through those things right now. And so once that's released and we get trained on that, just like, the great thing about the Army is, we're going to train our leaders on these. So once we get into and we launch it, then we can understand and ensure that our soldiers are ready to accomplish it.
Will the standards be based off how you perform on this test? Are you going to set the baseline yourself, do you think?
What do you mean by that? Rephrase that one for me.
We've created the new test. You've got pretty high level of fitness, so we'll send you out to take it, and that then serves as the baseline. Everybody has to rise to where you're at in terms of the run, the deadlift, and all the other events. Are you yourself, your performance on this test, will that be the new standard?
For myself, it will be. For everybody else, it'll be what the Army standard is, right? Is 60% in each event with a cumulative 350 for the close combat forces. But but that's the great thing about about people is that when motivated, they set their own goals and they have their baseline standards. And I have my baseline standard of what it is, and it's not easy when I get older either, right? And so I've got to work that much harder, to keep those goals and those fitness standards that I like. But again, that's the beauty of the Army is that we have a standard, and the standard will be adhered to by everybody, whether you're in a close combat force or a non-close combat force, to get those. And they're all achievable. They're all feasible. But I think if we're not pushing our soldiers, speaking as a leader, if we're not pushing our soldiers to be better every day on their next test, then maybe we're not doing our job as a leader either, right? I mean, that's the goal, is to be better every day at what we do when we wake up.
For sure.
I have a question that's in my head, and this might be too in the weeds of like DoD policy nonsense, and this might not be something you're familiar with. I don't know. But having watched the original development of the ACFT, I've also worked with other services on stuff they've done with their tests, seeing the changes. DoD instruction 1308.3, which is the instruction that dictates fitness and body composition standards, it articulates two different kinds of tests. One is a general duty test. It's force-wide. It's normed for age and sex. And it's just supposed to test general fitness. And it separately describes occupationally specific testing standards, which are described as sex neutral and specific to the actual job rather than the force. I'm curious about how the Army navigates what it seems like the DoD has an intent for there to be two different tests rather than different standards on the same test. And I'm also curious, just from having been in the Army, does the Army argue that all soldiers fall under the definition of physically demanding career fields? Because at the end of the day, all soldiers have the potential to be exposed to I don't know. I'm thinking through different lanes here. I don't know if this is something you've dug into.
So no, I have not dug into that DoD to do that. But I mean, as you described that, my thought would be, it's kind of what we talked about before. We have the AFT, the Army Fitness Test, and we have the high physical demand test that we do that assess, a soldier into a CMF to do it. Now, we don't do that. That's not like a yearly thing that we do, but it is something that we have within our doctrine or regulations that says if you're a 19 series, you must meet these physical requirements to do it. If you're an 11 series, if you're a 68, a 13, a 92, you must meet these physical requirements to do it. And so in the spirit of how you describe that, I would say yes, but I'd have to go back and look at that and really kind of just cross-reference, because I have not dug into that either.
Kind of a hot topic question, I think, and I don't know how much of these two kind of dynamics play together, but obviously the introduction of some new standards, elevating the standards, chasing after lethality. I mean, this is all great, but simultaneously, we're also seeing cuts to one of the programs that has provided objective return on investment when it comes to lethality in the Army, holistic health and fitness, but more broadly, just embedded human performance. And so maybe a broad question to kick this off, but like, where do we see this embedded human performance model existing alongside an increased emphasis on lethality when one seems to be going down and the other one seems to be going up, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think I'll answer it and try to phrase it how I do. And if I didn't hit the mark, please come back with a follow-up on me. But, as we talk about H2F, I mean, the whole premise of H2F, as you know, is human optimization, right? And how we optimize the human to be the best form of themselves that they can be so they're prepared for combat. And so how we have this done now, I mean, by the end of this year in October, we'll have 71 H2F outfitted brigade combat teams that'll be in the Army. Now we had, it was a struggle with our athletic trainers because there's just so many cross-domain responsibilities and authorities that they have to do that we decided to go with strength and conditioning coaches, right? Instead, it's now 11 per team to do those kind of things. But I don't think it's going to reduce the program at all, because that's why we have PAs. That's why we have all the other docs that help us get after that, right? And so knowing that our ATs are really there to get our soldiers back to duty quicker, to get after injury prevention and those kind of things, where our strength and conditioning coaches are really about the human performance and the optimization of our soldiers, right? And the other part of that is that H2F is not supposed to supplement leadership, right? It is there to enhance a leader's ability to get a better physical outcome or a better cognitive outcome for their soldiers, because they're using all 5 domains, of the program to make sure a soldier is ready. I mean, I think we can all say that, our mental domain, our spiritual domain, nutrition, all that stuff matters to make a warfighter. I used an example before, is that, athletes are phenomenal. Baseball players, football players are great because they do this all the time, and they're able to switch on and off the things that they need to perform at a high level at the drop of a dime, right? And they're predictive of what they're doing. A soldier maybe isn't always predictive of the level of physicality and energy that we need at any given time, because that's why we're there to do what we're told when we're told to do it, and we have to move out. So being able to manage our energy and manage all these domains and know when to switch and when to go allows us to get out to the door in a quick manner. That allows us to really endure the stresses of combat and or just being away from our family and or lack of sleep, because we're using these domains through H2F to prepare us for those kind of events. And so H2F as whole as a construct is hyper additive to warfighter lethality. I don't think we can ever go back from not doing H2F just because of what it brings to a commander and the soldiers themselves. But like I led off with, remembering that this is about human optimization, and this isn't about delegating leadership responsibilities to a team. This is about enabling a team or leaders through this team to have the outcome, because leaders own that fitness. They own the ability to make sure that their soldiers are ready for combat. And then we use, folks like yourself as our combat multipliers to make sure that we're ready and where we're failing. You'll see the gaps. And so I hope that answers and gets after what you were kind of looking for.
No, I think so.
I think it gets after it, but I also think we're going to have to press you on this one a little bit, kind of specific to the athletic trainers. And I'll leave some other things aside, because I think there's this broader trend of confusion where H2F has demonstrated return on investment through some pretty rigorous analysis, but continues to see cuts. We lost some of the most junior civilians, pretty useful members of the team. But for the AT one specifically, I think this has hit a lot of people pretty hard. You mentioned athletes as a comparison for soldiers, and like NCAA, every single division has athletic trainers. NHL, NBA, NFL, MLB, like every one of these teams has athletic trainers, because they've demonstrated effectiveness in preventing and managing acute injuries that happen during rigorous training and competition, something that's very specific to the military. I believe every branch of the military has utilized athletic trainers. They've been embedded in different programs for up to 2 decades in some cases. I pulled up some research from just a couple years ago, 2023. This was facilitated by some DoD researchers from the Consortium for Health and Military Performance. Adding athletic trainers to Army initial entry training cut the rate of discharges for musculoskeletal injuries by more than 50%, resulting in a yearly savings of up to $20 million in training costs. I think everybody in H2F is concerned about the loss of athletic trainers and what that might mean. But in particular, H2F is now embedded in initial entry training, where they absorbed those athletic trainer contracts that have existed for years and in some cases decades now. Fort Benning has been using these folks, Fort Sill, Fort Jackson. And by absorbing those contracts into H2F and then cutting them from H2F, we leave alone and unafraid some PAs.
Oh, they're afraid. I don't know if they're unafraid.
I mean, yeah, alone and afraid, some PAs at the battalion level out there trying to manage a musculoskeletal triage, diagnosis, and treatment burden that is massive, especially in that initial entry training setting. So I'm curious. I know this. We've seen some of the public information from the Army about it, but I'm a little bit confused as to why ATs had to be cut to keep the Army in control of the program, when the Army has been able to control athletic trainer programs in several settings for years now.
Yeah, thanks. One, I'll start off with this too, is that we got to remember the H2F is not meant for initial military training. It is not meant for BCT soldiers, AIT, and OSIT soldiers. It is meant for active duty soldiers and brigade combat teams and above. Now, those installations that have them, as you mentioned it, like Fort Jackson, Sill, and some of those other folks, that is for their permanent party cadre. And so in the training environment, what we've done is we've kind of built these cohorts of medical providers per brigade to help out and get after that kind of supplements. In extreme circumstances, the senior commander can obviously organize for however they need to organize with the resources on their installation to help, but that is not the primary use of the H2F for our initial trainee soldiers to be able to do that. So with the ATs coming in down there and all of our other providers we have that truly help out, we haven't seen a huge degradation in soldiers in the IAT, enterprise being basic combat training, advanced individual training, or OSIT, that's any different than it has been for decades to go. Matter of fact, because we got a little bit smarter in how we do things, we're still getting soldiers back into training a lot faster than what we've done before. I was part of a pilot at Fort Jackson back in 2016 when we put ATs in every battalion headquarters, and it worked. But there's a finite amount about those, those individuals anyway out there in the workforce. And so being able to continue to work with DHA to figure out how do we still potentially do this, not saying it's off the table, I would assume, with those kind of things, and we work through that. And CHAMP helps out with that too, right? I mean, that's kind of what they were designed to kind of bring everybody from the Department of Defense and all the different health and human optimization, things that we do, and those things together as a department to be able to do that.
Can I ask, so I know this isn't specific to you, but I'm kind of hoping there's a chance you sit in on some of these conversations, or you at least know that these conversations happen. But one of the things that has been said, not even just H2F, but just embedded human performance in the military at large, because inevitably with contracts and different administrations and things like that, stuff gets cut, stuff gets added. It's very fluid and sometimes unpredictable. As a strength coach myself, athletic trainers, all of these industries are very small. And so word spreads fast when jobs aren't secure, when stuff is tenuous. And I'm curious because we're pushing lethality, we're pushing readiness. These are all things that the Army knows and loves. And like I said, we've seen return on investment. And I have to imagine that there's probably a day, 5, 10, 15 years down the road where there is more money back on the table. We are looking to grow these kinds of programs. We reach into these industries again, and people just don't want to come and work in this space because on the one hand, we're told that we're very valuable, that we're doing great things. But on the other hand, hey, sorry, unfortunately, we have to let this go. And again, I know this isn't you specifically, but when we factor in all of that into the calculus, what sort of thoughts are put toward the industry's appetite to provide these services when called upon if we don't know what that career might look like, if that makes sense?
No, it does, and that's a wicked problem, because it's not even just us; it's the landscape of any jobs that are outside of the military and all those other things that are kind of going on. And I would say that's probably something that when we reassess the AFT, and as we constantly reassess the H2F program of being able to get better, that's something that we would definitely have to take a look at to say, okay, is it the time right? Do we have the right authorities to utilize athletic trainers? Because again, that's a coordination with DHA, because DHA really owns all the authorities to be able to operate, for our athletic trainers, and we got to be able to work those things together in tandem. And so I'm not in those discussions, but what I will say is I know that the teams that look through this, always look through it through the positive lens of, okay, we know what we want our end state to be, and we might take a little bit longer to get there, but we really have to continue to try.
Sure.
And then kind of figure that out. And then how do you incentivize is really kind of what you're talking about, to say, trust me, we love you, but we want you to come back, but maybe not for 2 years, right? I mean, what I mean? But that's the war for talent, that the military, the whole department, faces all the time, is that everybody wants all this great talent that we have.
Yeah.
And it's tough.
Mm-hmm.
One I have to ask because it was a crowd favorite. You're, I'm sure, familiar. Body composition exemption if you score 540 or above on the ACFT. As we move to a test that maxes out at 500 points, it's pretty hard to hit a 540. Do we expect to see an updated version of the body composition exemption?
Yeah, 100%. Right now, the current exemption is still valid through the end of the year, because the current ACFT is still valid, through the end of the year. And so that's still a go. We're working a rapid revision right now to continue that based off the new standards. So it'll be scaled down appropriate, just like we did for, the 6th event ACFT. It'll be scaled down appropriately for the AFT to ensure that we have that same thing. But we all realize that was a valuable tool and an incentive to really excel in your fitness. And so that is a thing that's continued. It's going to continue to go once they get that done and signed, and that'll come back out, and that'll be, should be probably seamless between the two when it rolls out.
Another fan favorite. So why sex neutral but not age neutral?
Yeah. So, I mean, the deal is if you're in a close combat force, there's got to be one standard to do it. Everybody's going to be expected to perform the same exact task, the same exact way, with the same exact rigor. And again, these things aren't going to be unattainable, unachievable for any sex to be able to achieve in a close combat force. And so they're going to do it. I've talked to a lot of the females in my formation here within TRADOC, and the ones that are in those close combat forces are excited because they want to be measured against their male counterparts, right? They want to be able to have that credence to say, of course I can do what you do, right? I can get to that standard that was required of us. And let's not fool ourselves. We have males in there that have sometimes, trouble getting those high scores on the ACFT, now the AFT. And so it could really go either way, right? But what I see is that all of our soldiers in close combat forces, whether male or female, they're going to pass this. I have zero doubt that they're going to rise to the occasion. As I continue. I hate to kind of keep saying that, but I just truly believe in that the power of the mind is going to make you rise to that occasion to pass and be successful.
Mm-hmm. You answered half of his question there, and I think we all here agree that people tend to rise or fall to the level of expectations set for them. If you set a low bar, they will settle in and get comfortable with that low bar. If you set a high bar, they will achieve that high standard. I think we agree with that. We 100% believe that the women in these formations can achieve these standards. But you said one standard, and these still are adjusted for age. So I think we're still curious, if there's one combat standard and the enemy doesn't care what sex you are, why would they care what age you are?
Because I'm old, man. No.
I love that answer.
I mean, I don't have the data in front of me by any stretch of the means, but I mean, as both of going through this, it does get tough when you get on. I'm a career infantryman. I've been in the Army almost 30 years as a career infantryman, and things don't get easier when you have tens of thousands of miles on your knees and your back and those kind of things. And so, basing it like that, I think matters, and I think it shows the ability to still meet a very high standard. Regardless of what you're going to see, regardless of your age, I still think I know that our close combat force, non-commissioned officers, because that's really what we're talking when we start talking about age is those more senior NCOs and officers that are in there. They're going to crush it because they have their entire career. It didn't matter what physical test they had, whether it was an APFT, an ACFT, an AFT, they're going to crush it. So kind of, it is what it is. And so I think because of the those unique physical demands within that CMF and the roles, it still meets mission requirements and mission effectiveness for that warfighter, regardless of how you described it. But I think there has to be a standard between sex. And then again, I'm old. I'm old. You're not getting any younger either, Alex and Andrew. I'm just telling you.
I agree, but you there just said that you think the senior leaders will still crush the standard, and I bet you can meet the young man standard.
You can throw the ball further than your son. You did say that.
Hey, it's right there.
And he hates it every time, and I make sure to remind him of that too.
But we will move on. I got to press you on a different version of that question, and that is, you said there's one standard for close combat forces, and I think we can all agree with the logic on that. Is there not one standard for the rest of the force? Is there a difference in expectation between men and women if they're not in close combat jobs? Why sex norm it for the rest of the Army?
That, we'd have to, I got to pull that data on that one. But I tell you, the standard is regardless 60% in each event based off, what you are with the 300. And so again, being the baseline standard of what that is, being the close combat forces were the priority to say that regardless of your sex, as a close combat force, you have to meet these standards. And that was just the priority of the look to make sure that our close combat forces met that. And so, I think that's, for me, that's really the reason why we did that. And I know that's probably not a good answer for you. But it's all looking at the close combat forces.
Mm-hmm.
But say we're able to scale the normal AFT for all other MOSs just to be able to have that standard.
Were any other changes discussed outside of just the standing power throw? I mean, additions, subtractions, planks, sprung drag carries, any of that, or was it always focused on just that one event and then raising the standards elsewhere?
You know, when they looked at it, everything was being looked at to determine what was the right thing, because again, it was about ensuring that we're measuring the right thing, like we talked about before. And again, that is what, you know, will inform what the scales look like, the scoring scales, right? But at the end of the day, the standing power throw was the one that was deemed that was probably the least effective in measuring, you know, strength or measuring what we needed to measure because of the technique, like we described earlier.
I'm going to ask a more specific version of Drew's question there. And this is a question anybody who knows me will have seen coming a mile away.
2 miles away. It's the standard.
Yeah, 2 miles. But
Come on.
A whole power throw away. Who knows what the distance is? I'm curious. And you said everything was on the table for discussion. And we've said many times that the Army is not expecting to go 40 years with the same standard again, like it did under the APFT. They're monitoring the data. They're looking at potential evolutions. I am a leg tuck fanatic. I understand that I'm a little bit biased. I am curious if there is any hope anywhere on the radar, and like it's important to consider that, like, even with my Army Reserve career, I got less than 10 years left and I want to see it back before I'm done. Is there any hope of the leg tuck returning to whatever Army fitness test iteration comes next?
Yeah, you know, honestly, zero idea. But what I will tell you is this too, is when we looked at that a while back, I don't know if that measured the right thing either, right? That measured more hand strength than anything else. And I think that was one of the things that we took a look at when we removed that for the plank also, is that it measured the wrong thing. We were measuring grip strength. And I don't know if that's what we needed to measure for our soldiers, is measuring grip strength. But I'm like you, I would crush leg tucks. Like, I don't know what it was. You know, I was good at it. But it did. When they gave me you know, when we rolled out the theory of why we got rid of it, it made sense. Because not everybody has the same grip strength. Again, you have to train for grip strength when you're sitting there hanging, depending on what your weight is. And then to be able to move that torso and that trunk, you know, up with your knees to be able to touch. Is that an effective measurement of what we needed for combat related tasks? I don't know.
So I will not turn this into a leg tuck episode, because I could happily do that, but we want to stay
how
on
the
track.
sausage is made when he says that. That's exactly where we're going.
But we're going to have a tiny bit of a conversation. And that is that if we were really, really focused on just measuring the specific primary component of fitness, then we wouldn't have a sprint drag carry. We would just have like a 300-yard shuttle run or a 400-meter run or something like that. We would eliminate all those extra things. And I think the ACFT was developed based on predictive ability for simulated warrior tasks and battle drills. That was the original design. We kind of retroactively applied specific components of fitness that were supposed to be assessed. I'm curious. I don't think the leg tuck is a good assessment of core muscular endurance. I don't think anybody thinks that. But I think it is pretty good at predicting a soldier's ability to navigate an obstacle like a 6-foot wall or something similar to that. And I wonder, did we set the leg tuck up for failure by pretending it was a core strength exercise instead of acknowledging what it was, which is a soldier's ability to move their own weight while suspended?
Yeah, I mean, that's a different perspective I never thought of. And not being involved in the evolution and development of the ACFT, I mean, I have no idea. Right. I mean, that's probably out of my scope and scale of my fitness knowledge and ability to do. I know it seems like I can talk really well about it, but I don't know. Again, that's a perspective to look at it, and maybe it was right. I mean, it very well could have been. But there's lots of things in the APFT. I don't know if that measured what we wanted to do either.
True.
Right?
I think we're.
I mean, I can train to max push-ups every day of the week. If I do 100 push-ups a day for 6 days, I will max my push-ups every day of the week, just because it's muscle memory. My muscle fibers know what I need to do within a certain time group, and I go. You know, probably not an effective way to measure back then when we did it. Now it's more dynamic, so I'm working different things to say these muscle groups, along with my shoulders and everything else can now endure these movements over time because it's a more dynamic, functional, movement, like you all know. So.
This reminds me, this is going to be a hell of a comp, but for folks that have seen Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, we have the Island of Misfit toys. I feel like we're headed towards the Island of Misfit PT test events. We already have, obviously, the leg tuck, and then now to that, we've added the standing power throw. Before we let you go, I do want to ask you a question that we've been asked, and then we've asked other guests this in the past just for fun. But if you had to design your perfect PT test, what would that look like? And if you want, I can give you a specific number of events, but I'm going to turn you loose and let you go crazy. What would you want to have in your PT test?
Yeah, I think, and this is going to, and it's not just because of who I am and where I am at and what I'm doing. I mean, I really love what we're doing right now. I've never been a functional fitness kind of guy. I've always been the meathead. I want to go to the gym and lift as many heavy weights as I can, and do those kind of things. But even when the ACFT rolled out, it took even myself to kind of wrap my head into how do I now navigate through these 6 different events to have this right amount of energy to be successful and meet the goals I wanted to do. It doesn't matter to me if it's 5 events, 4 events, 3 events, 6 events, but the programmatic of having those events and the cumulative effect on the body is what I really enjoy in life. I think that's what we need to do to be able to assess your overall endurance as you're kind of going forward. And so the construct of how we have, I think is great. To me, just like, as we described with the ball throw being technique, it really wasn't additive to the ACFT. It was another event that you had that you went through. But I think the current 5 that we have left, I think gets after everything that I've grown to really, really enjoy. I'm a competitive guy by nature. So right off the bat, the AFT is very highly competitive for me because anytime I can do something physical next to somebody else and I try to beat them, I'm a chase the rabbit kind of guy, right? So if you're doing 340, I'm doing 360. If you're going to run a 6-minute mile, I'm going to try to run at 540, right? It's just the nature of how I'm wired. And so that's what I love about it too. It does create competition and a healthy competition to push each other as you kind of go through that physical assessment also. So honestly, I wouldn't probably change a thing. And I think because one, it's great for the mass of the force too, right? It's easy to do, relatively easy to set up. You have to do good PT every day to do well at it, right? You can't just roll out of bed if you're not getting after some good unit PT. And so this is a good forcing function for units to get after that good PT, holistic fitness PT, not just the old, we're going to run and do sit-ups and do push-ups today and, and hoo and stuff. But we actually got to get after that holistic fitness.
Okay, I'm going to ask you one more because I'm going to get something out of you here. You're stuck on a desert island. You can take one piece of gym equipment with you. What's it going to be? And if you say the whole Army fitness test, I'm going to ask you again. So you get one piece of equipment.
I will tell you right now, it's going to be a deadlift bar. I will do deadlifts all day, every day. I love the deadlift. So that is like probably my favorite exercise. Okay, so deadlift is one.
He's trying to add stuff now. He's going to get a little back.
All right, deadlift and incline bench press.
I love that. Most people say
you've got a barbell. You can do whatever you want with the piece of equipment. You don't have to pick exercises.
I love that. That's awesome. All right. We will close on that. We know you're very busy. Thank you so much for coming on. Obviously, adding some context to the news that came out. We really do appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Thanks again for having me. Just let me talk on the AFT. The Army's moving in the right direction to make sure that we're getting after warfighter lethality. I'm proud of it, and like I said, I mean, our soldiers are going to get after it. They're going to do it because that's what they're charged to do. That's why they joined the Army, to be better than they were yesterday. And I'm just a firm believer in that. Again, I don't know. I'm passionate about those kind of things. I believe in our soldiers. I believe in our leadership. I believe in what we do. And so I just appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you.
Thanks, Major. How about this time I kick it off? Because I got to say, he knows this. I'm still an Army Reserve service member, and I am assigned to TRADOC, which is the command that he is the Sergeant Major of. So before we dive into the after the episode chat here, I want to say that any comments coming now are Alex Morrow, private citizen, podcast host, Mops and Mo's guy. None of this is remotely on behalf of me as a TRADOC service member.
For folks not looking, he's wearing a quarter zip, not a
I'm not in uniform.
not in uniform. It's
I
a good looking
promise.
quarter zip too.
Yeah, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
To some degree, this was reasonably predictable, right? This is coordinated through public affairs. They're giving us a senior sergeant major of the command that kind of owns holistic health and fitness, Army combat fitness, now Army fitness test. And he's got to answer in the way the Army would answer, because he was speaking on behalf of the Army, right? This was officially arranged. Unlike me, he can't just like yell his opinions into the internet. He has to consider the reflection on the command that he represents. So I think there were a couple justifiable and well executed, professionally performed dodging of the questions in there.
Enviable, really. I like that talent.
But what do you think, Drew?
I'm with you. I mean, like, folks that have been listening for any period of time, like, we've had senior ranking folks on before. And first and foremost, before I say anything else, I do want to be genuine in my thanks for these people coming on, because this is in his workday. We're putting him on the spot intentionally. He is effectively speaking on behalf of the entire military, or sorry, the entire Army, on a topic that has gotten a lot of traction on social media. Well, really two topics, because we asked him about H2F and we also asked him about the PT test. So just off the cuff, you're going to have opinions in all kinds of directions from the audience. And so full credit to him for coming on and speaking to that. Now, having said all of that, I do agree to your point. Like, some of this stuff really is important. For me, H2F specifically, I have a lot of biases because I work with this every single day. I see the impact that this has, because I realize at one level, athletic trainers going away, right? Like, that's just a math equation where DHA won't allow it, whatever. And then now those guys are gone. But on a human being level, these are jobs. These are people. Like, they have come to work every single day, oftentimes making less than they could on the outside. They've shown up and had a real impact on soldiers' lives. And I've seen the text messages from soldiers to some of my providers saying, like, oh, you're the reason I'm reenlisting. Thank you so much for this. Like, a real and measurable impact. And so when we ask some of those questions, you would sort of hope for a response that would speak to some of that. But I also understand, now that we've been doing this for as long as we have, like, sometimes you're just not going to get that. At least from folks in these positions, speaking in these capacities. So it is a little bit disheartening, frustrating, what have you. And I'm sure, like, Command Sergeant Major, just like any of these other senior ranking folks, if it was just the three of us, like, kicking it and having a beer, we'd probably hear some different things. But it's just not going to happen in this forum. So I get that.
I'll jump in and say real quick before we move on from that athletic trainer thing. This is a topic you're going to hear us talk about repeatedly for a while now, because one of my biggest concerns is that it'll get tons of attention for like a week and then everyone will forget about it. And if that's the case, the people with the authority to take action on this are not going to take action. But why did we bring it up in this context? Even though it's kind of a little bit outside of Sergeant Major's lane, like, this isn't something he can change, right? Like, we get that, and he can only give the answer he can give. But we still brought it up on purpose, because we want to continue to promote awareness of that as a significant concern. And Drew mentions it's real people and it's jobs, and like, I absolutely care about the athletic trainers. But I also know, like, kind of Drew being the representative of the human performance professions here, and me being to some degree the representative of the Army folks, I don't think you're going to convince Army senior leaders by telling them about the impact to the
for sure
people working the jobs on the contract. I think you're going to change their mind by talking about the impact on soldiers, because we have the data from the Air Force, we have the data from the Navy, we have the data from the Marines, and we have plenty of data from the Army that athletic trainers save more money than they cost. I know that doesn't change everybody's mind. I don't think data influences senior leader decisions as much as we wish it does. But I still do think that with the appropriate data and the appropriate stories and the appropriate testimonials from service members who've experienced it, I think that there is enough time between now and the end of the fiscal year to press on this issue enough that we can potentially get some action from the kind of people who can influence it. And we'll talk separate from this podcast in other forums, and maybe a whole podcast episode on where this decision actually came from. It was not an Army decision, I can tell you that.
Mm-hmm.
but it is a decision that senior enough leaders in the Army and the DoD could change under enough pressure. So that's why we keep talking about it.
No, and I know we could go on and on, but I guess my last thoughts just on the PT test stuff specifically. I think there's an interesting undertone that we sort of asked about, but it is delicate, which is to say that there's a political piece to this. I mean, there's a reason why certain things are changing and changing very rapidly, quite frankly. Whereas before, anybody who's been around test creation understands that it's a process. There's research behind a lot of these things because what they want to be able to do is to back up questions about why this, why that. Oh, well, here, look at the data. That takes years. And we saw that happen with the ACFT. And then here we are in a situation where it seems like just, flick of the wrist. The test has changed, has a new name, new standards, gender neutral, yada, yada, yada. Some of that makes sense. Some of it is being driven by other folks, and that's just kind of the nature of the beast. So I say all that because I think some of the questions we asked about, with the leg tuck, but other events being changed, I think if I had to guess, we will see additional changes in the future as this rolls out. It makes sense to take away the standing power throw. It's an obnoxious event. It makes cool stickers, but it's an obnoxious event, and nobody looks cool doing it. But I'm curious what version 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of this new Army fitness test looks like.
I will say, I've thought more about the standing power throw in the last 36 hours, 72 hours, something like that, than I had kind of at any point before. Read a bunch of research, have started drafting a post that'll be out by the time people hear this. There's some interesting arguments on both sides. The standing power throw does require a greater degree of coordination and athleticism than any other event requires. But again, this kind of comes back to our episode about the different purposes of a test and camera versus engine versus map, right? I don't think it created the best incentives. And I say this as a person who's looked out my window at work and seen guys just
Throwing
standing
balls.
power throwing their way up and down a football field. I still think we should train power. I still think we should train athleticism. I think we should aspire to that. I just don't know if this was the event necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
We'll talk about that at more length at another time. People who listen to this have heard Drew and I go back and forth on the ideal test, and I think there's something to say for simplicity. You might have heard me allude to it in the conversation here, but I'd also be okay with swapping out the sprint drag carry, which is doing too many things all at once, for something like a 300-yard shuttle or a 300-meter shuttle that tests anaerobic capacity more in isolation rather than just blurring the lines with a way too light sled drag and a too light carry to really be meaningful.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's interesting too, the reasoning, the alleged reasoning behind getting rid of the standing power throw kind of makes a case for having something like a leg tuck. Because you're talking about, we got to elevate standards. Everybody should be able to ride. And he said it himself, and we've heard this before from other people, they're going to rise to the standard. They're going to do, I trust my soldiers to do, and I get that. But why then take away the thing that you always advocate for, which is it is challenging. It does require that you train. I mean, I get what he's saying about grip strength, but grip strength correlates to so many longevity markers. Why would you not want to have a measure of grip strength? So we could wax and wane about that forever, but yeah, it's interesting. Like I said, I'm curious to see where this thing goes, and if something changes, you'll hear it here first, hopefully.
Bottom line, we appreciate the Army playing ball here.
For sure.
Mops and Mo's, we're sometimes instigators, we're sometimes critical, we're sometimes starting fights, but we're still willing to send us senior leaders to have some of these conversations.
Yep. All right, team. See you next week. Team, welcome to the tail end of our conversation with Michael Moss. I'm going to be honest with you. I know I showed you before we started that I had eaten a Cadbury cream egg. That was actually my third of the evening. So when we talk about processed foods and bliss points and marketing and people being suckers for all that, I mean, I like to say that I was unwillingly tricked into purchasing those things, but holy shit, when Easter comes around, do I eat a ton of Cadbury cream eggs. So, but in all seriousness,
is that an addiction that you have to Cadbury cream eggs? Is it a lack of willpower?
It's an addiction, but I don't know what you would call like what's a willful, like I knowingly am doing this to
No,
myself.
so that I talk about addiction a lot at work, actually, in a weird way. We talk about it in relation to like cell phones and sleep and like the influence between those things. And my working definition of addiction is when you continue a behavior when it meets two criteria. One, you know it's bad for you, and two, you don't want to do it.
Then that's absolutely an addiction. Wait, no, I do want to do it.
That's the thing. You do want to do it. So I don't think you're quite into addiction territory yet.
Perfect. So it's healthy.
I don't know about that.
Well, it's newsflash, Cadbury cream eggs are not eggs. There's no egg. There's nothing. Yeah. Okay. Let's get down to brass tacks. Michael Moss had no business talking to us.
No.
But
wildly overqualified for this platform.
Supremely overqualified. However, everybody should go out and read both of those two books because they're fascinating. And if you haven't gone down sort of the rabbit hole of what should we call it, the processed foods genre. I know we've talked about Michael Pollan a couple of times here, Michael Moss obviously as well, but a fascinating landscape. Just the ways in which these companies manipulate things and market things and intentionally go about positioning things so that you as the consumer have to like actively try not to eat like ass is mind-blowing. I mean, one of the things that I always think about is going into the grocery store for basics like eggs, milk, real eggs, not cream eggs, but like milk, eggs. You got to go through the milieu of processed bullshit to even get there. And that's like, so again, I know a lot of people probably realize this, but it's crazy to me that that's kind of the world that we live in at large, not just in the military, but even more so maybe in the military setting, because like he mentioned, we almost have more control and we choose not to exert it. When it comes to choice architecture and the food environment that we're existing in. So you could go down a ton of rabbit holes, but I'll leave it with that.
Yeah, my only real takeaways here, like, yes, absolutely, go read the books, Salt, Sugar, Fat, and Hooked. Both had a ton of insightful stuff that I've already referenced it at work since even reading the books before even having this conversation. I'm just still rattled by like the fact that I just got compared to Jon Stewart as an interviewer. I'm processing that a little bit. I mean, this guy, like, you're supposed to go through like the Harry Walker agency to book this guy to speak. He's spoken at like some of the highest levels, some huge events, invited by some of the biggest companies. He's been on the Daily Show. It's just super cool that he stays this accessible.
Yes.
And
power of LinkedIn.
Probably, I was going to say probably the worst takeaway of this whole thing is that the universe continues to send me messages that I should keep on
being an asshole on the internet,
being an asshole on LinkedIn, because it has consistently led to good things, like across the board. Like, I don't know why. I just do a little instigating, and all of a sudden, something good happens. I don't know what it is. I'm trying to stop doing it, but the universe is telling me keep on going.
Well, I'll give a little plug here then for our website and our contact form. I know we've mentioned this to folks many times, as I think any good business should, but Alex and I love talking to people. That's why we do this. We love talking to people like Michael, who, like we mentioned, we have no business talking to, but who can provide a very interesting perspective to listeners. And I know from engaging with a lot of you, universal you, listeners, people like listening to our conversations with non-military types. And so if there are authors you like, if there are, I don't know, I'll throw politicians in there, just anybody that you like and you want to hear about, both Alex and I are dumb enough to want to reach out and just blatantly ask them to come on to the Mops and Mo's podcast. So feel free to hit us up, give us some recommendations. Bear in mind, rule number 1 of the podcast is if you ask to come on, you cannot come on. But there are workarounds. People have found workarounds. But if there's somebody that you want us to talk to, maybe not like up at the presidential level, we haven't figured out how to access that one. But below that, we can find ways to make it work. hopefully.
And even better if you have access to the person somehow.
Even better.
Right? Like that certainly greases the gears a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
The number of times I've received messages about bringing like obvious famous characters onto the podcast, like cool, but unless I have an in, I can't get that person. And I'll also just underline what Drew said about like contacting us through the website. Until a few months ago, I don't know how many months ago, I read, and to some degree, even if it was just an emoji, responded to every
I saw this
message
on your Instagram
on the
story.
Instagram page.
I'm proud of you for this.
Last few months, I have not been doing that. Not even close. Not even half. Probably not a quarter. So I'm like a little bit sorry, but I'm also not sorry at all because it's much, much better for my mental health.
Can I just pause you there, just so people are aware of how bad this problem was? We would be recording episodes, and you'd be responding to Instagram comments.
That didn't happen very often. I'm
Very
sure it
often
happened once
is
or
carrying
twice.
a lot of water, but the point, yeah, it happened. So Alex is a healthier person now because of you folks out there choosing to use the contact form instead of the DMs.
Yeah. So that's all. Like you might get a response on a DM, maybe. Just depends on the day and what's going on and the
You'll get a
timing.
response when you email us. So
Yep.
I think that closes us out. Team.
Yeah. Thanks, guys.
Yep. See you next week. Eat healthy this week and avoid processed foods.
Hey, Alex, let's cover our ass real quick.
Oh, great idea, Drew. All right, guys. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent.
Thanks for tuning into this week's episode. Before you go, please rate and review the pod on the listening platform of your choice. You can also visit us on our website at www.mopsinmos.com. That's mops, the letter N, mos.com. You can check out the library of podcast episodes, our latest blog entries, any helpful resources, and also sign up for our newsletter.
Drew nailed it. Just to underline a couple of things, the podcast entries have in-depth show notes on the website. So if you missed anything or you want to read any of the research we talk about, it is all there. You can, at the bottom of the website, sign up with your email and receive future updates from us. The blog posts go a little bit more in depth in kind of written form on a couple of topics we get questions about all the time. But most importantly, I just want to ask all you guys, our best way the word gets out is absolutely word of mouth. So tell your friends, tell the people you work with, anybody you think would find it useful. Thanks for spreading the word.
If you have any questions or comments, feel free to shoot us an email at either Drew or Alex at mopsinmos.com.
Or there's a contact form on the website.